Show today. Today we've got Corey DeAngelis on. He's an expert on all things education. If you don't follow him on Twitter, you should. He's really been fighting for the rights of kids to have a great education. And he's been dispelling a lot of the myths that are out there about homeschooling and about alternative choices that you have in terms of educating your children. And really been out there to call out the war that there's been on parents and parents having the right to choose what's best for their children. So thanks for coming on today.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
So, this will be a little more informal of a show than we normally do. Normally we're in our studio and it's kind of like all hashed out, but we kind of wanted to approach this as parents because we have 3 kids, and I feel like a lot of the stuff we've been experiencing is stuff that other parents are experiencing and that we've talked with friends about, and not just people who watch our show or follow us on social media and stuff like that. So, for us, just as parents, I would say we lived in California, a large part of our life with our kids. We moved a year ago to Tennessee, and in California was our experience that there was just overwhelming indoctrination, even in the best private schools, and that it was only getting worse. I knew it was getting bad when they brought in a white guy to tell my Hispanic daughter that she couldn't sit at a table with all white kids because it may make children of color feel unwelcome. And I was like, okay, we've crossed the Rubicon into something really dangerous. Where they're teaching kids to see each other as colors instead of as people, and we made the choice as a family to move to Tennessee and, try to get away from some of that for our kids' sake so that they could just have a non-political education. But I would say even here, we were surprised once this whole pandemic happened. We started to have these online classes, where kids are learning online, and we started to kind of see that what we thought our kids were learning was not, in fact, what they were learning. And that there was still a lot of that indoctrination seeping in. It wasn't as overt, I would say. It was more stuff that, I'd say, unless you're in tune with how the left is working on sort of finding these little areas to push the way that they think things should be taught, you may not pick up on it. But given that we have sort of an expertise in that area of knowing like the way they've changed linguistics and the way that they've done these things, we picked up on all these things. And then there are some more overt things, like in Spanish class, there's a Che Guevara poster, and being Cuban, that's especially not something that I would like to see in my child's classroom. But, so all these things line up, and a lot of parents are asking themselves, what do we do? Our kids are not being educated the way we want them to be, and they're maybe thinking about homeschooling, but homeschooling has always sounded scary to them or like just too much work, and they just don't know what to expect. So what would you say to those parents?
I just started. I do most of my work in school choice, and one of the strongest arguments for school choice has to do with this political indoctrination. It can come from both sides. It can be too far right, too far left. But from what we've mostly been seeing and just anecdotes throughout the country, is it has been mostly left-leaning indoctrination occurring in the schools. You said you used to live in California. There was recently a teacher in California, I believe was an economics teacher, and on her Twitter account, she was explicitly admitting to a lot of political indoctrination that she was committing in the classroom because she thought her account was anonymous. And I can send you a link to this story that happened just earlier this year. But she was admitting on her Twitter account that she was in class telling her students that the Trump regime was a fascist regime, and she was comparing Trump to a Jonestown cult leader. All of these things over the last few years that she was admitting, saying, I told my students this, I told my students that, and she even admitted that I'm not going to even tell both sides of the story anymore because that other side, the Trump side, she was arguing I'm just not going to tell that side anymore. So that came out earlier this year. That was just one example. And I mean, the basic logical conclusion of that is that we should have choice, that we shouldn't be forced to fund this type of political indoctrination that we vehemently disagree with. And we shouldn't be forced, of course, to send our children to schools just that are assigned based on the zip code where you live. And you should be able to choose wherever you want to send your kid, especially if there's things like this going on. I will say the Cato Institute Neil McCluskey is their director for the Center for Educational Freedom over there. And I've done a lot of work with him myself. They have something called the Cato Institute Battle Map. It's a map of the United States where they have all sorts of these disagreements that happen, whether it's political indoctrination or other forms of indoctrination that are occurring in the schools. And they track all these little events that happen that just, again, the logical conclusion is, well, I shouldn't have to fund that, first of all. And secondly, I should be able to vote with my feet to a school that isn't having that type of issue.
Yeah.
I will say, although California gets a lot of things wrong, they have one thing that's pretty beneficial for families who want to pursue homeschooling. And you might not have realized this when you were living there, but if you enroll in something called a virtual charter school in California, the state will give you some portion of the funding that would have followed you to your child's traditional public school. So you can enroll in a virtual charter school and homeschool your children and get about $3,000 per year to offset the cost of homeschooling in California. So California is one of the few states that actually has this. I will say other nations have this. School choice and educational freedom seems to be the norm across the world, except for the United States. For example, in Alberta, Canada, they have something similar. If you homeschool your kids, you get 25% of the expenses to cover those costs. Tennessee doesn't have anything like this, I don't think, but there are things called education savings accounts, which are a form of school choice that allows you, when you opt out of that residentially assigned government school option, you get some of the funding to offset either private school tuition or homeschooling expenses through that education savings account funding. So that's something to look at in Tennessee and elsewhere. But look, a lot of states don't have school choice, and that's one of the biggest problems with the education system today, is that we have a huge monopoly. And when you're not happy with what's going on in the schools, you don't have a lot of options. I mean, you can complain and try to elect different people to the school board, but that's not a very strong, meaningful accountability mechanism, because those are low turnout elections. You don't have a lot of meaningful choice for the people you can pick with school boards. And even if you get the right people in the school board seats, there's no real guarantee that things are actually going to change at the classroom level. So I've argued that the only way to truly hold schools accountable for academics and then also this political stuff is to be able to vote with your feet. And look, these other changes can take decades to occur, or years and years to occur, and people just don't have time to wait anymore. Why should anyone's children have to sit inside that classroom for even just another day? They should be able to pull their children out. And that's why I've argued for school choice programs. And for the listeners who don't know, the basic kind of definition of school choice is it's anything that allows you to escape that residentially assigned system, monopoly system, and be able to take some of those dollars to a private school of your choice or a homeschool of your choice. And I know you wanted to get in a little bit of kind of tips for parents. I would say that you should go to, if you don't have a school choice mechanism, like a virtual charter school in your state. A lot of states do. So look into virtual charter schools or these private school choice programs such as education savings accounts. It's a quick Google search. You can figure that out, or go to edchoice.org. Edchoice.org has a list of every state. They have a map where you can look into your state and see the options that are available. But also, if you want to just homeschool without any of that, kind of government intervention through school choice programs, you can look into Homeschool Legal Defense Association, hslda.org. They have their own map that shows all the states and the different regulations around homeschooling, and it goes through the steps that you have to take if you want to homeschool in your particular state. So hslda.org is a good example there. But then also, I would look at learneverywhere.org. There's also a Facebook group called Learn Everywhere. Tens and thousands of parents are already in there. They've kind of spontaneously come together into this Facebook group, sharing tips and tricks with experienced homeschool families, and then also new homeschool families trying to figure out how to homeschool your children for first-time families that are doing so. So Learn Everywhere, HSLDA, EdChoice, those are all good resources.
That's great information. What can you say about like hybrid? You know, there's programs in a lot of states, you know, where your kids are still going to get that social interaction, sports programs. I know in Tennessee, we have a great homeschool network here where kids are still doing the same stuff. They're still playing on sports teams together. They're still having social interactions, but they're just doing more independent work. So what do you think about that? What is the research on this hybrid models?
Yeah, I think that's a very good idea, the hybrid homeschooling model and the micro-schooling model, which I'll touch on both in just a second. But this is, you know, there's a lot of arguments against homeschooling, or at least people will make the arguments that it's just not feasible to homeschool because they will argue, well, one, it might not be feasible for single parent households or households that do not work from home and have dual incomes that the parents have to go and be away from the children each day. Well, two alternatives to that to kind of offset this type of issue would be one, what you mentioned, which was hybrid homeschooling, which is kind of an in-between between full-on homeschooling where you're homeschooling your own children in the home, and kind of an in-between with private schooling. Whereas with hybrid homeschooling, let's say you can only homeschool, you know, you can't do it 5 days a week, but maybe you can do it, you know, 2 or 3 days a week, or maybe even just 1 day a week, where you have kind of this hybrid where you send your children to the brick and mortar school for a few days a week. But then if your work schedule permits, you can do the homeschooling experience for a couple days a week as well. So that's kind of that hybrid homeschooling option you can look into. But something that if I have children in the near future, which hopefully that happens soon, I want to pursue a micro schooling option. And I think this is the future of homeschooling and education in general, in that it allows you essentially to outsource the process of homeschooling. So I, you know, myself and my spouse, you know, and my partner could work not from home full time, even though I do work from home full time now. I could theoretically go and work full time and then outsource the task of educating my children to a micro school, which is kind of like an in-between between full-on homeschooling and private schooling as well. Whereas you get 5 to 10 children in a household together, and you have a teacher or a guide that can kind of have the student kind of direct the learning for themselves, so that they're interested in what they're learning and so that they're actually learning what they're looking into, and then have the guide there just for safety reasons. And then also if the children have any questions, the guide can help those 5 to 10 students in the household. You still get that kind of one-on-one attention that you would get with homeschooling, but then you can also outsource this task, whereas you don't have to do it yourself. So it may be more economically feasible. And one micro school network to look into if you really want to learn more about this would be Prenda Micro Schools. They started in Arizona, but they're branching out to different states as well. Kelly Smith is their CEO. If you want to look at a talk on the Prenda Micro School model, you can look at my Educational Freedom Institute podcast. If you just Google Educational Freedom Institute podcast, Kelly Smith Prenda Micro Schools or something along those lines, you'll find it, and you'll find a full hour-long discussion about that option. But I think it would be good to, you know, to pair this with school choice to make it economically feasible. Because if you're a well-to-do family, you know, you already have essentially some form of choice in your children's education. You can afford to pay for a private school tuition out of pocket. You're more likely to be able to afford this micro-schooling option. And you're more likely to be able to afford to move residences to the best government-run schools around. So this is one reason why I've argued that school choice is an equalizer in society, and it really shouldn't be a partisan issue, because one, look, it improves the school system through market forces, but then it also is an equalizer. So it's a win-win. The left and the right should be able to get behind school choice. And in my scenario, you'd be able to opt out of your residentially assigned school and fund students rather than the system, just like we do with any other taxpayer-funded program. Just think about Pell Grants at the higher education level. The money follows the student, and the student can take it to a public university, a community college, a private university, or any other, a religious or non-religious university if you want. Pre-K programs, it's the same thing. You get the money and you take it to a public or private provider of pre-K. Food stamps, the money goes to the families, and the families can choose to shop at Walmart or Trader Joe's or Harris Teeter or Whole Foods. and there's a lot of choice in any of these other markets, even if you have government providing or taxpayers providing some of the funding for this. We would never say that you have to residentially be assigned to your closest Walmart. And if you want to go somewhere else, well, too bad, the food stamps stay with the Walmart. That wouldn't make any sense. But that's essentially how our K-12 education system works today. So I just had to, make sure I say for the listeners that we should fund students instead of systems in K-12, just like we do with all of these other taxpayer-funded initiatives in education and elsewhere. And with the micro school idea, just think about it. We spend over $15,000 per year per student in government-run schools in the United States. To be exact, it's $15,424 per child per year. In DC, where I live, it's over $31,000 per student per year. But just think about what kind of virtual education or micro school education you could provide for students if that money followed the individual families. And let's say you got 10 kids together in a micro school setting. If you're in DC, $30,000 per kid, that's $300,000 per micro school. That would be really good for teachers if they could attract customers. They'd get paid a lot more than what they do in DC today, and then they'd have about a third of the class size. Yep. So another thing is that school choice benefits teachers too, and that's lost in the debate. The debate is almost framed like it's like the teachers versus the parents, and that they're having a tug of war over the kids. No. It should be. It's absolutely a win for teachers and families, but that's not the same thing as it being a win for the teachers' unions, which oftentimes do not represent the real needs of the individual teachers in the systems. Competition in the market for goods and services benefits the customers. Competition in the labor market benefits employees, which are the teachers in the system. And there's a lot of studies I could go over empirically showing that as well, that competition benefits teachers by increasing their salaries as well. But yeah, just think about it. If you can get 10 students together, $300,000 in revenues just think of how much different the education system could look like if we instead funded families instead of systems. And another way we could do it, people should look at, there's this thing called unschool.school. If you just type that into your browser, unschool.school, it's kind of like the Airbnb of education. And I think that's also kind of the frontier and future of education, where, the whole idea behind Uber, for example, was that there was this untapped supply of cars sitting around, and people that, didn't have a lot of, they had like extra time on their hands. And so Uber kind of tapped into this supply that was just kind of sitting around, and that benefited so many people. It provided a lot of jobs to people, and it also provided people with a cheap or a more affordable way to get around than just the regular taxi system. But unschool.school takes that idea and applies it to education. So you can essentially, homeschool your children. If you're looking for an education service provider, you open up the app and you can say, okay, I'm going to use this expert for math, this expert for science, and it's an affordable option. That's and really just think about how affordable it would be if you had those education savings account where you opt out of that government-run school. Let's say it was funded at $15,000 per student. Let's say in order to save the taxpayer money and make it politically feasible, just give every family $12,000 instead of $15,000. That would be a win for everyone. And look, you would be able to afford to use this type of future of education app for your kids. I mean, we have choice in every other aspect of life. Why can't we have choice in one of the most important aspects of our lives, which is our children's education?
Absolutely.
100%. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the big things with school choice you mentioned, I know you try not to be nonpartisan, you try not to get into politics, but, I can't help myself. When it comes to school choice, you said it shouldn't be partisan, and it shouldn't be, but it is, so am I wrong to say that the reason it's partisan is solely because the Democratic Party has an allegiance to teachers unions, and teachers unions are fighting against school choice tooth and nail? Because on the Republican side, what I see, and I've had this conversation a million times, and I can say that in my life, having these conversations with the Republicans, I've only had one Republican ever disagree with me on school choice. And they, to be honest with you, they didn't have any good reasons why they disagreed. But it was, that's been my experience. But on the Democratic side, I mean, it's just been pushback, and it's all related to the teachers unions. And I asked them, I'm like, if let's say these kids in Baltimore, predominantly minority children, if their lives matter to you and their education matters to you, why don't you want them to go to the best school? Because right now we're spending $16,500 on each one of those students, and you have one of the worst literacy rates in the country. You literally have kids leaving school, going into their adult life not knowing how to read, and that's not acceptable.
Yeah, so, when you push people who oppose school choice on this, they're put in a really weird situation, because you've seen on my Twitter where I just ask people, how does allowing disadvantaged groups to have more choices when it comes to their children's education harm them? Because opponents of choice will try to make the argument that school choice harms certain groups of individuals, which I will say, well, why would giving these groups more choices harm them? And I think they usually want to pivot away from that. They usually don't want to respond to that question. I think there are a couple of things that they could say, which most people would find absolutely abhorrent. One is they believe that these communities just aren't capable of choosing schools for their children. And some people have actually out loud said these things that they might make bad choices for their kids. And to which my response is, well, families know a lot more about their kids' needs than bureaucrats sitting in offices thousands of miles away, and they have a much stronger incentive to get it right. Just because you're a lower income individual doesn't mean you're not smart, and doesn't mean you don't care about your kids, and it doesn't mean that you don't have the competence to choose the schools that work best for your kids. So some people will outright say that's why they oppose school choice, but I think the real reason and a strong reason for some people is what you're alluding to, that it could be the teachers unions. If you look at opensecrets.org, I think it's .org, I tweeted about this and I think you might have retweeted it, but if you look at the campaign contributions of the American Federation for Teachers, I think it's the second largest teachers unions in the United States. There are only two national teachers unions in the United States, and American Federation for Teachers is one of them. If you look at their campaign contributions from the most recent election cycle, it's over 99%. I think it was 99.2 or 99.4% went to Democratic candidates. So I think I just tweeted something along the lines of, teachers, I know 99.2% of teachers are not, Democratic, in the polls that I've seen. They're a lot more diverse in that sense than what the teachers unions are showing. So I just kind of question, are the teachers unions actually representing your views? Which the obvious response to that is that no, they're not. They're not representing the actual views of the teachers in the system.
I hear that all the time from teachers, that they feel totally unrepresented by their unions. And
you're also right that while it shouldn't be a partisan issue, it kind of is in the United States today. That doesn't mean that Democrats will never come out in support of school choice. There are some Democrats that do, but if you just look at the numbers and you look at the proportion of candidates that are Republican versus Democrat that support school choice, Republicans are much more likely to support school choice. You saw Donald Trump for the past couple of weeks and Mike Pence have come out very strongly in support of school choice. Donald Trump also appointed Betsy DeVos, who has been a longtime advocate of school choice as well. Joe Biden, on the other hand, has even come out against public charter schools, which aren't even private schools. It's not even a private school choice, mechanism. And I think he's going to lose a lot of votes on that. I don't know if you saw the Wall Street Journal article just from 2018 when DeSantis was elected governor. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, they said it was because of school choice moms. They have over 100,000 families using school choice in Florida. And the average household income of the students using that program in Florida is only about $27,000 per household. These are very disadvantaged populations of students. And if you look at the racial composition of that particular program in Florida, I think it's about 80% are Black or Hispanic using the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program. And DeSantis most recently signed a bill that massively expanded their school choice program by about 25,000 or more students each year going forward in Florida. So Florida is the state to look towards if you're looking to how to reform your system and have more educational freedom in your state. Arizona is another good state that's done really good things on the front of school choice. But look, I mean, school choice, when it started in Milwaukee in the 1990s, was a bipartisan effort. It should still be a bipartisan effort, but for some reason, and I think there's some strength to your argument that it could have to do with the teachers' unions that have gotten people to kind of diverge and come out against it, even though there's no logical argument to be for forcing kids to go into a particular school just because of their zip code and having zip code determine their future. There's no excuse for supporting that kind of system, and there's no excuse to prevent kids from being able to choose the schools that work best for their families. And I mean, look, rich people already have school choice. I alluded to this earlier. And so if you're gonna, look, the Democratic Party has for a long time argued that kind of they're the party to kind of lift up the little guy. I mean, at least that's what they've argued, right? If that is the truth, then you should also be for school choice because it's an equalizer. You can't go around saying that you're for equality in society and then come out against school choice. That's just logically inconsistent. And I also want to point out one other thing that's an inconsistency that is coming from mostly left-leaning candidates, is that a lot of people who oppose private school choice at the K through 12 level are absolutely in favor of programs that I alluded to earlier, like Pell Grants and pre-K programs. Those are both voucher programs as well. Pell Grants are a voucher; it's a higher education voucher, but you have people like Elizabeth Warren that are for expanding Pell Grants and for expanding. You hear for calls for universal pre-K. That's essentially a voucher program. The money goes to the families, and families can pick public or private. Yep. So if you're going to, the only reason why you would support one of those things and not the other is if you're for increasing government size in education. And if you think about it, at the K through 12 level, a voucher is a decrease in government involvement with unions. Go ahead. Can you hear me?
I think you're going out a little bit. What were you saying?
You cut out. Sorry. Go ahead and finish.
Oh, the only reason why you would support, Pell Grants and pre-K programs, but then oppose K through 12 vouchers is because at the K through 12 level, school choice is a decrease in government involvement and an increase in voluntarism and individual liberties. Whereas in the pre-K level and the Pell Grant level, those vouchers actually increase government spending, increase government size, and increase government involvement in those forms of education. So I think that's why there's this disconnect. But whenever you call someone out on this and say, "Oh, are you against Pell Grants too?" they'll say no, and then they'll pivot to some other argument.
Yeah.
Sure.
So that's if you're trying to argue with someone on school choice, they typically support pre-K and Pell Grants. So just call them out on that, and then also call them out on food stamps, because a lot of people who oppose vouchers for K through 12 support vouchers when it comes to grocery stores, which is food stamps.
Right. I can't not say something about the hypocrisy of the school to prison pipeline and systemic racism and this, that, and the other, when you're arguing over outcomes and trying to have equal outcomes. How can you have an equal outcome when you have an unequal start? It's illogical.
Yeah.
And so that's why the logic doesn't really even matter in this conversation in the context of fighting the school and all that, because when we talk about the school boards, who's making up the school boards, who's making up these teacher unions, it literally is against individualism. So it's against, the individual growth of a child. I mean, down to the individual growth of a child, how they learn what's best for them. It's a collective approach on all fronts. Bigger government, bigger teacher unions, against the individual and what's best for them. So I think it's important to point out.
Well, you know what you said too? You said a million times that and I only say things that are, sometimes it'll sound like I'm disparaging the Republican Party. I'm not. As you can see from my shirt, I'm a Republican, but I will criticize things that need to be done differently. And one of the things that you've gone after that I love is you're like, if they have a brain, they're going to go out there in every minority area in the United States, and they're going to go door to door talking about school choice, because it is a civil rights issue of our time. It's predominantly, and it is some, there are, being poor doesn't go to just one race. There's a lot of poor white people in America. In fact, more poor white people than anybody. But just about in terms of demographics in these areas, the people who are least, sort of spoken to about school choice seem to be these communities, and Republicans have abandoned those areas. And you've said they need to stomp the pavement, right, and they need to get there, talk to them, and let them know where we stand, because, it could be the biggest change in our lifetimes would be if we had every Black child, every Hispanic child, every Asian American child, and every white child in America all have the same start in education, the same ability to break through and go to whatever, higher institution they want to go to, or trade school they want to go to, or whatever it is they want to do when they're done. But to have that same start and the same curriculum and the same, ability to thrive, we would see just exponential change in so many areas. This affects crime. It affects, poverty levels. It affects everything. So it's just, it is very, very important.
Yeah, and I mean, it almost seems like the defenders of the government-run school system will pretend that there's just, equal access to a good education in public schools in the United States. And come on, give me a break. Everybody knows that there are very good public schools, but then there are kids who are assigned to really crappy government-run schools. And there are vast inequities inherent in the government-run school system today. So if you're for equalization, well, you should be for a system that allows not just the rich to exercise school choice by residence, by moving to a good neighborhood, or by going out of their pocket and paying for a private school in addition to paying for the public school through their property taxes. So you would be all for school choice mechanisms such as charter schools and private school voucher programs and education savings accounts. And we can't leave out the fact that zoning is rooted in a lot of discriminatory redlining in the United States since the 1930s. If you look there, I have this book on my shelf right now called A Fine Line by Tim DeRoche. And he goes in and just shows how the school district boundaries in the United States today oftentimes mirror the same discriminatory redlining practices that were going on in the United States in the 1930s. And so a lot of kids are kept out of good public schools just based on where they live because of this discriminatory practice going on in the government school system. And, you also pointed out hypocrisy that goes on in the school choice debate. And this is something I like to point out a lot as well. If you look at the Educational Freedom Institute website, we have something called the School Choice Hypocrisy Map. And there are tons of politicians who argue against school choice for the less fortunate members of society while exercising school choice for their own children.
Absolutely.
That's right. Yes.
First example of this was Elizabeth Warren. This was the first person that I found using Ancestry.com. I wrote about this in the New York Post after I exposed this. She actually lied about it to a parent in her face on camera, where the parent was just saying a very logical argument. Look, she was saying, it's okay that I just want the same kind of choices that you had for your kids, because I read somewhere, and she was alluding to my New York Post article, that you sent your kids to a private school. I just want those kind of options too. And Elizabeth Warren really quickly said, no, I sent my kids to public schools. That was a lie. And it went viral on Twitter. It went viral on all forms of social media, because that's not true. And you shouldn't lie to a parent and a voter to their face like that, especially when it's on video. That's a huge mistake. And you shouldn't lie to people in general. But look, this is a recurring theme so often that we created a map on the website for you. You can look over your state, and you can find all of these hypocrites in your state who exercise school choice for their own kids, but then fight really hard when it comes to the less fortunate being able to exercise additional options.
Right.
Well, you see the same thing in school safety. We've had Andrew Pollock on, whose daughter Meadow died in the Parkland shooting. And one of the things that we saw a lot living in California is we had our kid in one of the best private schools in the country by, their measurements that they make. I didn't perceive it that way, because it was basically a far left indoctrination camp is what it ended up being. And what we found was all these parents, so, not all of them, let's say like 85%, are the same people who are saying that we need gun control. There shouldn't be any of this stuff put into schools. There shouldn't be a guard with a gun or any of this stuff at a school for other kids, for underprivileged kids. But at our private school, we had gates, we had a check-in system. You had to have like you
armed ex-military members guarding their children.
So you can have somebody armed to protect your children, but kids in Compton shouldn't have somebody armed to protect their children. That's the same type of bigotry that I see here in these arguments, especially from politicians who I know utilize a lot of these, like what their kids have to work with is just so beyond what a kid in Baltimore has to work with. You know, they don't have access to the robotics team that our daughter had when she was in this private school. You know, so these things, they are unequal starts. And on that side of the aisle, they just haven't been willing to deal with that or to even admit to it. You know, so I think that going back to what you've been saying, they need to go into these communities and we need to talk to people. And I think we saw evidence in Florida of what happens when you run on school choice. That is why Ron DeSantis is the governor of Florida right now. Had he not done what he did, and he did exactly this, he had his teams on the ground talking to people in districts where he knew he wouldn't win the district, but he upped his share of votes in that district by going door to door and talking to people about school choice and saying, hey, I believe your kid deserves the same access to education my kids have. And it was a winning argument, especially right now. You know, I talk a lot about the politics side of it. She talks more about the education side of it. But on the politics side of it, you know, Trump does face a bit of an issue with suburban women specifically. And what better way to, you know, get over that hill than to talk about how, you know, their kids deserve to be empowered to make the choices for their own children, you know, because even in those areas, schools can be improved. So, you know, this doesn't just affect poor children. It affects every child, really, that their parent would be empowered to be able to make a better decision for them, because maybe they want to send their kid to a religious school, but, you know, even though they're not paycheck to paycheck, they can't afford to do that, you know, and if they had that money to be able to make the decision themselves, then they would be able to do that. So these things, you know, we have to empower parents to make decisions. And I think it's an overall part of the larger war against parents making decisions for their children. And you see this in so many different facets of life where the government intrusion just continually sort of creeps into what your parental roles are and what their role is. And there's an expanding sort of desire to reach into our kids' lives and have the government be a third parent. And I think that, you know, it's part of our responsibility as parents to make sure that we don't add a third parent, you know, in the government. So I think, you know, it's something that I hear a lot from parents and we talk about a lot on the show. So, you know, I sort of, one of the things I do want to touch on is a lot of parents ask, you know, what are the simple steps? If I want to leave the school I'm at, what are the simple steps to leave? And what does it look like for me to start homeschooling? So what's the best sort of advice you can give in very simple, clear steps?
You know, because there's a lot of parents that, you know, can do it. They're like, homeschooling's the best. I'm here full time. It's the best experience. But there's some parents that just can't be home full time doing it. So what options are there for parents that work that are sick of the school system and the indoctrination?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different options, and it really depends on your particular state. So again, I would say go to hslda.org, Homeschool Legal Defense Association. They literally have a map to where, you know, if you live in a particular state, you click there and they'll tell you the specific steps you need to take in order to start homeschooling. It's oftentimes, you know, homeschooling is relatively free in the United States. We're a relatively free country when it comes to being able to educate your own children at home. There are some states, though, like New York, for example, where you have to administer the state standardized test and get a particular score, which is kind of like having government schooling at home, which isn't true freedom in education, I would argue. But most states, it's relatively free. And I think sometimes you have to, you know, send a letter of intent to a government office. For example, in North Carolina, I think I might have sent you a tweet on this as well. But in North Carolina, recently, because so many families are saying, well, we want to homeschool, it overloaded their government school website because so many families were going in and saying, you know, putting in their intent to homeschools, and it broke the website because of all of the demand. So sometimes it's just as easy as that, as you know, putting in that intent to homeschool. But look, there are, you know, for some families, it's not an option for homeschooling for whatever reason. I would say, you know, before giving up, though, you know, even if you think it's not an option now, there are still ways if you try hard enough to where you'll be able to make it work. But other options are charter schools. Most states have charter schools in the United States. I think 45 states now have charter school laws on the books. But I think only 21 of those states have virtual charter schools, which are allowed. And you can message me to see if you have virtual charter schools in your state if you want, because I know of a list that has all the states that do have virtual charter schools, or you can just go on Google and type in virtual charter schools with the name of your state right next to it, and you'll find a list of them where it can kind of ease that transition to homeschooling so you don't have to do as much of putting the coursework together. Other people have looked into learneverywhere.org to ask other families how they did it, and I think that's really good to ask families that are actually currently homeschooling and to get their advice. And then also looking into homeschool co-ops in your locations. It's kind of like the micro school idea where maybe you only teach the group of kids in your co-op math or something for one day a week, whereas another family takes care of the English and the social studies and other types of topics. So it's homeschool co-ops in your area. You might want to look into those as well. And then edchoice.org has another map that has all the states and what type of private school choice programs are available. So that could be a voucher program where you can take some of the money to go to a private school like they have in Florida. They have like 5 different private school choice programs in Florida, for example. I think Tennessee has one that's an education savings account. But I think, there are certain eligibility requirements. So you want to look into that as well. But EdChoice has, all of these, drop downs for, eligibility requirements, what kind of schools they can be used at, what kind of expenses these funds can be used for, and how to actually go through that process. So that's another way to see what options are available to you.
That's great. We're hearing from some commenters that California recently passed a bill that makes getting funding for homeschooling very difficult. A couple different people said that. I was going to give you some viewer questions. One of the viewers asked, how do we measure if our child is gaining from homeschool, especially if they have an IEP?
I want to respond to the virtual charter school thing going on in California right now, because that's totally ridiculous. And I went on a couple podcasts to talk about this, but it was a certain bill that got passed just pretty recently. And what it does is it doesn't make it illegal. It's not necessarily illegal to switch to virtual charter schools, but they make it very hard to do so. And they make it really financially difficult for virtual charter schools to accept new students. So what they did was, instead of making it completely illegal, they couldn't get that. That would probably be their first best thing that they try to do. But what they did was freeze enrollment counts for the prior school year, what that does on paper, or just realistically in practice, is that, since there are so many families that want to switch to virtual charter schools right now, let's say, 20% of families switch to virtual charter schools because, schools aren't reopening, or because schools are providing pretty crappy, virtual remote learning in the state. Some schools may be doing that, or maybe, for whatever reason that families are wanting to switch. Maybe the families are still just kind of concerned about coronavirus and their children. Whatever the reason is, a lot of families are reporting that they want to switch. And state legislatures have seen this. And then most recently in California, they're making it so that funding doesn't follow the child to the virtual charter school. So while it's technically legal, they technically can switch, it makes it very costly to do so for the virtual schools, and it essentially financially punishes virtual charter schools for taking new students. Because if you get new students, you have the additional cost of educating those students, but you don't get any extra money for doing so, whereas in other years it would have been totally fine. You would have been compensated for, and rewarded for actually serving families in this time of need. But because they passed this, no good anymore. And Pennsylvania did something similar. Oregon did something similar. Wall Street Journal wrote about that too a couple of months ago, where Oregon actually did make it illegal to switch. You couldn't even enroll in a virtual school if you wanted to. But yeah, Pennsylvania also made it financially costly to switch.
This is just about controlling parents, because they're seeing there is a shift happening with parents. I mean, I've never seen so many parents talking about what to do because of during COVID, they realized what their kids were actually being taught. Everybody's stuck at home. You're listening to your kids' lessons. They're talking to you about their questions they have during school time instead of their teacher. And it became abundantly clear that they were not getting the best of the best. That, at least in our case, even at a private school, it felt like our child was sort of sitting through stuff that was for the benefit of other people versus for the benefit of herself. And she was just kind of bored the whole time. So there's a real push in these states that I'm seeing to just control what parents do because they're afraid so many are going to leave the public schools.
Well, that's exactly it. It's the monopolies really freaking out. And you saw the unions in, the Pennsylvania Association for School Administrators lobbying to make it illegal to switch in Pennsylvania. You saw the teachers unions coming out in Oregon to make it illegal to switch. And it's all because of these families saying that they want to do something else. And it's because they know they're going to lose a lot of students. And, a lot of students comes a lot of money because schools are funded based on enrollment counts. So if you lose students, you're going to lose a ton of money unless they can go through the government to try to protect themselves. And that's essentially what they're doing. And I'll just hit on a couple data points really quick. We've seen a lot of surveys come out finding huge switches to virtual or home education next year. And it's not just, anecdotes. These are, rigorous data. EdChoice, for example, did a nationally representative sample, nationally representative survey of families, found 52% reported that they had a more favorable view of homeschooling as a result of COVID-19. Only half that proportion said they had a less favorable view. So they're twice as likely to say that they have a more favorable view. American Federation for Children commissioned a survey, national survey as well. 41% of families said that they were more likely to homeschool after the pandemic. USA Today did a similar poll, finding 60% of families said that they were likely to continue homeschooling even if schools open up in the fall. Gallup did a most recent poll finding something similar, where 44% of families reported that they want either full-time virtual instruction or part-time virtual instruction, even if the schools reopen. So every single survey is suggesting there's going to be a radical change in the education system. And that's why you have all these forces in different states fighting against allowing families to exercise these types of choices that would have otherwise been fine if they didn't go and lobby to the government to make it illegal to switch or to make it costly to switch to these other options that were already on the table before the pandemic, that families would have already been able to switch beforehand. Right. And then also to get back to that question on IEPs and how your children are doing well in the homeschool setting. Well, if you think that the standardized tests are beneficial, I tend to be against standardized tests for a lot of different reasons. But if they do provide some information, and if you want to administer those tests to your students, you can still do so and compare them to other individuals in your state. And you can also do a nationally norm reference test where you can compare your students' test scores to other students throughout the country. So just because you opt out of the public school doesn't mean you can't do anything that the public schools are doing. So you still have that option. And I will say, when it comes to IEPs, I would argue IEPs don't actually guarantee educational quality in the public schools as well. Otherwise, you wouldn't have thousands and thousands of students with special needs opting out of the public school system whenever they get the chance to do so. It's probably because these federal laws aren't actually producing good outcomes for students with disabilities in the public school system. Mm-hmm. I've seen it firsthand where a lot of the times they'll just check a box. That's essentially what a lot of these laws do is they'll say, okay, we hired this particular person and we put the kid in a particular room for all day. And even though they weren't learning anything, well, we did everything that we said that the law says we have to do. And so we check the box, but that doesn't actually mean that those kids are actually getting a meaningful education. And I would say having that one-on-one attention in the home through homeschooling or another type of micro-schooling setup is actually more beneficial for all types of students.
100%. And I really wanted to bring this up because we've talked so much on our podcast about there's 1,000 reasons to abandon the old traditional schooling model. But there's also 1,000 reasons, aside from those negative things, to homeschool that are positive, aside from the fact that the other system is failing our children. And I really want to change the attitude and narrative around homeschooling. Because again, media and teachers unions, vested interests have perpetuated this narrative that like homeschool kids are weird and different and unsocialized and uneducated. They can't get to schools of choice. Yeah. And it's just fear tactics. It's fear tactics to make us subservient to the system that is failing our kids. And I want to bring that up because, I have awoken to this new notion that our kids are not happy in school. Why are we accepting that our kids are not happy in school? Is it that they don't like learning, or is it that they don't like how they're learning? Because kids love to learn. They're innately intuitive. They're innately creative and curious. And we're just squashing that innovation that they're naturally, inclined to have in this one size fits all model that doesn't fit a special needs person, but it also doesn't fit an individual. So I think that we have to also focus on this from an outdated model perspective, and I can't think of a better person to elaborate on that. But we just talk a little bit about like what the modern studies and science are saying about how kids learn best. And I've heard a lot about project-based learning, passion-based learning, discovery models, all of that, where kids are actually self-motivated by their interests in problem solving and critical thinking skills, community-led projects where they feel like they're making a difference, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, the factory model of schooling is outdated. I would say it's always been outdated and a pretty big waste of time. And because it squashes creativity, it squashes love for learning, and it crushes these innovative talents that are inherent in children. And the whole point of the common school system in the United States came from Prussia, right? The Prussian education system was made to create obedient soldiers, and it was made to make people more similar, which is I would argue, a completely anti-American way of doing things. I think America was founded on this principle of pluralism and accepting, alternative cultures that are different from your own. And if you look at the common school movement in the United States, that started with the first compulsory education law, or the compulsory schooling law in Massachusetts in 1852. The main arguments behind this were to make immigrants more similar, to make them more American, whatever those people thought at the time. And so it was all about squashing creativity and creating a more obedient populace. If you look at the history on this, I would recommend looking at John Taylor Gatto's books on the history of the American public school system, and it's a pretty gloomy history. And I just have a recent empirical study that was accepted for publication at Social Science Quarterly with Angela Dills, who's a professor at Western Carolina University, and we found that these compulsory schooling laws are associated with reductions in innovation and productivity. And again, it's because this factory model schooling is antithetical to productivity and innovation. It crushes creativity. And so if you want to look at that, it's the working paper version is available for free, and it's called Does Compulsory Schooling Affect Innovation? And the kicker there is that it reduces patents per capita and productivity per worker over time. So I would recommend looking at that. But then also, if you want to look at the homeschool research and what the research says on homeschooling in general, I would point you to Brian Ray's 2017 systematic review of the evidence published in the Journal of School Choice. And he found over, I think, 40 studies. And he found that not every study was positive for homeschooling, but the vast majority of those studies, I think about 80 or more %, pointed in the direction of homeschooling children faring better academically and socially than their otherwise similar peers in the government-run school system. And look, I like that you pointed out that there's all these myths in the homeschooling debate about socialization. That's one of the hugest myths in the homeschooling debate, and it's totally ridiculous. And look, I went to government schools all through K through 12, and my teacher always told me to stop socializing. I mean, what are you talking about? There's all this socialization going on in the government-run schools. No, it's about obedience. I wasn't allowed to talk to my peers. And then there's also all of these negative forms of socialization that occur in the government school system that maybe it's not a bad thing that the homeschoolers are missing out on these forms of socialization. What am I talking about? I'm talking about all the bullying that happens on a day-to-day basis that leads kids to sometimes commit suicides. There's been research by, I think it was either Harvard or Yale researchers, which I could provide you the link after the show, a peer-reviewed study finding that the school calendar is linked to increases in spikes in teen suicide rates. I've done a similar study finding that school choice, which is a form of educational freedom, it's not homeschooling itself, but school choice has been associated with reductions in teen suicides and increases in reports of mental health satisfaction. And so educational freedom seems to be a good thing for those types of outcomes. But look, homeschoolers get to avoid the bullying, the drugs, the gang activity, and all these other forms of negative, so that the obedience training that occurs in the government school system. So maybe it's not a bad thing that they're not well socialized in all these forms of socialization.
Yeah, it's but how you think socializing.
Well, and not only that, it's one of those things where, if we're all being honest, if you've been to a public school, I mean, really any school, but if you've been to public school, like, let's be real, there's a lot of weirdos at public school too. So, is there maybe a weirdo or two homeschooling? Maybe, but there's a lot of weirdos at public school too. So you can't hide from weirdos. And, that's not a way to educate your child or to be worried about your child. There's plenty of ways to socialize. There's classes, there's teams. They now have, somebody was asking, is there partial homeschooling? There's that too, where you can go 3 days a week to, a classroom and then go 2 days at home. And so you're kind of like having the best of both worlds. There's all types of options, but the socialization thing has always been a weird argument to me.
And I mean, just imagine thinking that the only way to socialize with other individuals is to be trapped into a government-run institution for 13 years of your life for 7 to 8 hours a day. I mean, how do we socialize when we're not in that system? How do we socialize before we go into that system? And how do we socialize after that system? Well, we have voluntary associations with other groups of people. And as you pointed out, look, you can join a club sport. You can even get involved with extracurricular activities at your local public school. Some states have things called Tim Tebow laws, came from Florida, where you can be a homeschool student and still play football or another sport at your local public school. So you can get socialization that way without being silenced in the classroom, which, let's be real, again, that, in the classroom, I was always told that I'm not supposed to be socializing. So it's not actually occurring in those. And look, homeschoolers have more time to engage in other forms of socialization. In a 2019 peer-reviewed study published in the Peabody Journal of Education, published by a researcher named Daniel Hamlin, found that even after controlling for differences in the background characteristics of the students, he found that homeschool students, and this was a nationally representative sample of students of about 15,000 individuals, that homeschool students were way more likely to be engaged with family and community activities, such as going to, the museums or going to concerts or eating, at dinner with different groups of people. And those are forms of socialization that you just have more time to engage with if you're homeschooling and not stuck in a government institution for 8 hours a day for 13 years of your lives. So, that's my typical response to the socialization question. And you're right as well that we shouldn't compare anecdotes to on one side of the equation and not act like it doesn't occur on the other side of the equation.
One thing I think is really important to point out is there's a real push and emphasis on social emotional learning and empathy and soft skills. That's, I'm sure you're familiar with all the studies, that being what most hiring practices are adopting is these soft skills being so important in determining who they hire. So when we look at that, that's a big shift in education, because now what we're saying as a society is those soft skills are more important. So but they can also be very sensitive in nature, because when you're handing over like a topic like sex or gender or things like that, and you're handing that over to a government to then educate your kid on, that can be a pretty dangerous thing, as we're seeing in schools and the extreme ideologies and very linear, homogenous thinking, being taught, our values of critically thinking, and the whole idea of what we think school is supposed to be about, teaching our kids to be critical thinkers, is really evaporating, right before our eyes. So, I think parents really need to consider that shift in education is happening, diversity practices, all of this social emotional emphasis that we bought into, thinking, oh, this is great, I want my kid to be more empathetic and kind, and yay, anti-bullying day. And then we really find out there's coded language and what a mess.
It's really about other things.
other things, other agendas. And we're handing that over, that new education framework and emphasis on the social emotional learning to a government, essentially.
Yeah, and the problem with that is that it's one size fits none, right? I mean, you essentially force a minority viewpoint or a viewpoint that just doesn't, understand what's going on in the system, and you force that particular ideology on the rest of the population, which no one should be for that, left or right. You shouldn't want to force your ideology on the rest of the society and the public school system, on other people's children. That's completely anti-American, I would argue, and just anti-individual liberty. And the logical conclusion is let people sort to the schools that have the type of education systems that they want. And maybe the social emotional learning is beneficial in a particular type of school that you opt into. Because look, yeah, social emotional learning could be a good thing, but it really depends on what's happening in the implementation phase, what's actually happening on the ground, and what does that actually look like, right?
It's fantastic,
right?
But in practice has been a really just a delivery method for leftism. And that's the problem, is that when you do stuff like this, you start politicizing value, like behaviors. And that's what's really dangerous with kids, is that's just not acceptable. Kindness is not owned by leftism, okay? In fact, even New York Times has admitted Republicans donate more money to charity than Democrats do. Not that I'm like trying to, shove that in their face or anything, but just the idea that, you can only be kind if you're a Democrat is just it's a bizarre idea. And that's sort of what we've done with this social emotional learning. It's attached these bizarre ideas and politicized it into, well, if, you care about people, then you're going to use the term Latinx. And in reality, 98% of Latino people don't want to be called
like the term, yeah.
So, and I've actually seen this in school with a Spanish teacher doing this, and I approached them and I asked them, and I was like, hey, I'm Latino, my mom's a Latina immigrant, and I don't know anybody in my family who wants to be referred to as Latinx. That's not like, it's not something we're concerned about, but it's also something I don't want to be called that. It's weird, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. It sounds like a porn category. It's all about degenderizing everything, that's the real goal with it.
I mean, a lot of teachers don't like this either, even if they're public school teachers. And I've had people on my show, who've gone to the Supreme Court. Rebecca Friedrichs from California. She went to the Supreme Court against the teachers unions in 2018. She was the lead plaintiff in that case. And a lot of it had to do with, the sex ed stuff going on at school. And, the unions were representing one particular ideology, which I think is what you're referring to. But the teachers, weren't feeling that they were being represented by that ideology. And they were essentially being forced to teach these things to kids, and they want to keep their jobs, right? And so they don't want to get fired, so they kind of go along with it. But the union has become an extremely politicized group that it doesn't seem like they're just focusing on education anymore, or I don't know if they ever did, but they're focusing a lot on these other political things. And again, I think that's I'm still okay with unions existing as long as families can vote with their feet, and so that people don't have to fund them and fund the types of education that they're putting into the system. And you certainly shouldn't have to send your kid to those schools if you vehemently disagree with what's going on. And look, people are going to disagree no matter what type of curriculum is put into a particular uniform school system. The problem is that it's uniform, right? And so no matter where it is on the political spectrum, let's say it's very, right-leaning instead, there's going to be a lot of people that don't like that. And there might even be Republicans who say, well, this isn't Republican enough. And instead of just trying to find, there's no way you're going to find a balance to make everybody happy, because we're just a diverse group of people and we have very diverse views, and that's okay. We're a pluralistic society. And if we're going to, be okay with living in a pluralistic society, we need to be able to have our education system mirror that fact, that people should be able to self-sort and not be forced to fund things that they disagree with.
Right. Yep. And the reality is, we were looking for just a politically neutral, critical thinking education that presented all sides. If we're going to talk about whatever issue, global warming, we're going to talk about all sides. And unfortunately, it's not existent. It does not exist any longer, because it's, the nature of how these schools are run, the independent private school, conglomerate, they have ways of hiring people and agendas to push through. So at the end of the day, there's discriminatory hiring practices. They're not going to have the other side presented. And
it's sort of like journalism. In journalism, 96% of journalists had donated to Hillary Clinton during 2016. 96%. They can say they're not discriminating in hiring, but that's a pretty large.
It's hard to prove, right?
It's kind of hard not to think there's some discrimination afoot when you're at 96% in donations for one particular candidate and party. And that was something I think The Hill, it came out with that. And they're pretty center lane in terms of their coverage. If anything, I'd say maybe a little center left. But, it's the same thing in education. At those higher levels, the disparity is so wide in the thinking and in the political ideologies that I think that's what's being produced now. It's a product of that disparity in terms of their ideology, and there's really no way around it except for empowering parents to create something new. And that's what school choice does, because if we're able to walk away from a school, whether it's public, private, whatever, and be able to say, you know what, you're not doing a good enough job in these areas, the school's going to hear that, and you're going to leave with your money, and they're going to have to fix it if they want that money back. And that's the real power that we have with school choice is it comes down to dollars. If enough parents walk, the schools have to change. So in Baltimore, for instance, where they have the literacy issues, I guarantee you that if all of those students left those schools that are not performing and they went to private religious schools or private schools or whatever, and the literacy rates go up, guess who's going to fix that to get those students back? Those public schools that failed are going to have to fix it if they want those students back, or they're going to shut down, and those teachers can be hired elsewhere.
That's exactly right. And I think Trump said this a couple of weeks ago, where he pointed out that school choice is good for everybody. It's a rising tide that lifts all boats, because it, like you said, incentivizes even the public schools to do better, because once they start losing money, they say, oh crap, we better change something so that we don't lose students and the dollars that are attached to those students. This is also one of the biggest myths in the school choice debate, where people will argue that, there will be some kids left behind in the public schools and they're going to be worse off because you're draining funding from the public schools. And first off, I will respond that, school choice doesn't drain money from public schools. Public schools drain money from families. School choice just returns the money to the hands of the rightful owners. The money is meant for educating individual students. But if you look at the research on this as well, there are 28 studies on this now, the most recent one being of the private school choice program in Florida. 28 studies on this. 26 of the 28 studies find statistically significant positive effects from school choice competition on the children who remain in the public schools. So you can benefit from school choice without even having to switch schools because of those competitive pressures. None of those 28 studies find statistically significant negative effects overall. So there is no rigorous evidence finding that school choice harms the children who do not switch to private schools. The preponderance of the evidence suggests the opposite, that competition is a rising tide that lifts all boats. And Trump was right when he said this a couple of weeks ago, that competition benefits everyone when it comes to essentially any market, and education is no different. And I can share the link with the viewers on that as well. And then also, I have a table with all those studies, but then also there was a meta-analysis published in Educational Policy in 2019 that summarized all this evidence and similarly concluded that competition from school choice has positive effects on the children who don't even use the programs. And then lastly, I'd like to argue that even if the evidence was opposite of this, even if there was some negative effects on the children who didn't exercise school choice, that would not be a legitimate argument to prevent a low-income family from switching to a private school and from allowing those dollars to follow the child to the school that works best for them. My individual liberty to choose a school that works best for my children should not hinge on whether the government school system reacts positively in a competitive way to me voting with my feet. My liberty doesn't hinge on that. And so that's not even a good argument, even if the evidence were not in favor of school choice when it comes to this question. But I will say the evidence is largely in favor.
I'm responsible for my children's well-being. I'm not responsible for the government's well-being. That's not my job.
Just apply this to Pell Grants. No one makes this argument with Pell Grants. Imagine if people said that Pell Grants, if you don't use them at your community college, you're draining funding from the community college. So we got to force everybody to stay at the community colleges and get 2 associate's degrees there because you're going to harm the kids in the community colleges. Oh, come on. No one would make that argument because, look, everyone understands you should just be able to pick the school that works best when it comes to Pell Grants or pick with food stamps. No one says, oh, when you take your food stamps to Trader Joe's, that harms Walmart.
Right.
I'm sure if the system was in a particular way where you were residentially assigned to your nearest Walmart and you can only use your food stamps there, those arguments would be made to protect that system, because there would be a special interest involved there. But we don't have that with food stamps today. And I think most people would argue that would be totally ridiculous that if we found, for whatever reason, that me voting with my feet from Walmart to Trader Joe's, produced a negative competitive response from Walmart, that wouldn't be a good argument to force me to shop at Walmart. And so similarly, it shouldn't be a good argument to force people to spend their education dollars at government schools.
It's funny, good ideas, they just seem to carry themselves, but bad ideas have to be enforced constantly. So, it's interesting. The parallels there with almost every aspect of policy around school, whatever it is, the idea that we have to force anybody to do anything is really sad, that a good idea can't just attract everybody to something that is proving itself to be a good idea and to be beneficial for everyone. So
and I also want to point out, there's no good argument against, homeschooling your children and having that freedom. There's no good argument against allowing the funding to follow the child to the school that works best for them, especially when it saves taxpayer dollars at the same time. There's no good argument for that. But I also want to point out that people argue that school choice defunds public schools. As I said, that's not the case. It's the case that public schools defund families. But then also, although public schools are funded based on enrollment counts, they aren't completely funded based on enrollment counts in the United States. So it's usually about 60 to 80% of the funding is based on the amount of students you have in your school. In Texas, for example, it's about 66% of the funding is based on students. So what does that mean mathematically? It means when you take your voucher to a private school, the government school gets to keep like a third of the funding. They get to keep 33% of the funding for a child who's no longer there. They don't have to educate that child anymore. And so I would argue school choice actually financially benefits the government schools because on a per pupil basis, they end up with more money per child. When I go from Walmart to Trader Joe's with food stamps, for example, Walmart doesn't get to keep 33% of my funding. And I think that Walmart would be happy if that was the case, right? If they got to keep a third of my grocery bill each week. But that's not how it occurs with K through 12 vouchers. It's actually set up in a way that benefits the public schools and the families at the same time. And so literally there's no argument to be made that is against school choice program. I would argue that 100% of the funding should follow the child. There's no reason why the school should get to keep a third of my funding for not educating my child anymore.
I agree.
100%. Well, we're gonna have you back on because this is a big topic.
Wide topic. Yeah.
There's just so many angles to absorb here. So thank you so much for answering questions and having this awesome conversation. We're really happy to have had you on the podcast today.
Yep.
Thank you so much for having me.
Talk to you soon.
Thanks so much.
Bye, guys. And by the way, don't forget to like and subscribe on the YouTube channel. Follow Corey. His @ is on the bottom of the screen on the ticker, and it will be in this description of the video on YouTube. So like, subscribe, send to your friends who may be considering homeschooling or considering alternative options.
Have a good day, y'all.